Welcome to Leading Through Uncertain Times, a case for servant leadership with Haub School of Business Associate Professor of Management, Dr. Ronald Dufresne, and Dr. Thomas Beeman, Executive in Residence for the Haub School of Business. Today is Thursday, April 23rd, and it is 12 p.m. If you feel so inclined, I invite you to answer the two polls that will pop up on your screen shortly. You are also welcome to ask questions to our presenters through Zoom's Q&A feature throughout the hour. If you are willing, please include your name, your city, and your class year if you're an alumnus. I'm Rosie DeFilippo from the class of 2015, and I have the distinct pleasure of hosting today's event. First and foremost, I hope everyone and their loved ones are doing well during this unprecedented time. I want to take a moment to extend a sincere thank you to all those on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, from medical professionals and farmers to grocery store, restaurant, sanitation, postal and delivery workers, and all those who can't or aren't staying home in order to help us through this time. We will forever be grateful to you and your service. Also, a thank you to St. Joseph's University for coordinating this unlimited learning webinar series, an opportunity to engage with university experts and cutting-edge content through virtual events. What a wonderful way for our community to stay connected, something we truly need now more than ever. And a special thank you to our two presenters, Dr. Dufresne and Dr. Beeman, for joining us to provide insight on such a relevant topic. Dr. Dufresne earned a BS in Engineering Management at the United States Military Academy in West Point, an MS in Organizational Studies, and his Ph.D. in Organization Studies from Boston College. He is an Associate Professor of Management and Director of the Leadership, Ethics, and Organizational Sustainability Program at the Haub School of Business. Dr. Beeman is Executive in Residence for the Haub School of Business and a member of the College of Arts and Science Advisory Board at St. Joseph's University. With more than 45 years of experience in the healthcare industry, he has served as the Chief Executive Officer of Lancaster General Health and President and Chief Executive Officer at St. Thomas Health Services in Nashville, Tennessee. He was also the Chief Operating Officer of Regional Operations at Penn Medicine and has also served as Executive in Residence at Penn Medicine. In addition to Dr. Beeman's impressive professional career, he served as a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy Reserve, ending his career as Assistant Deputy Surgeon General. Welcome, Ron and Tom. Before we dive in, Maria, could you share a bit of the poll results from the audience? Great. So for what is your current knowledge level of servant leadership, we have just over 50% saying intermediate. And regarding the second question, which of the following best describes your feelings about this unique moment in time? About 61% say resigned. I worry, but I'm focused on adapting to new routines and making the best of it. Thank you so much for everyone that participated in the poll. So to start us off, Ron, could you give us an overview of the theory of servant leadership?
Sure, and I'll first start off by just echoing everything that Rosie said at the start about gratitude for everyone out there doing the real work in this moment. In our little community just now, a lot of gratitude for our colleagues in IT who are pulling a lot of strings right now, rewiring a lot of things to get this going. I'm very happy and grateful to have this opportunity to be here with everyone today, and was able to read through the attendee list, and I see a lot of current and former students, see a lot of colleagues, and that illustrates the draw that Dr. Tom Beeman has if they're coming on to join us. So to your question, Rosie, what is servant leadership? Certainly about half of our attendees have some intermediate level understanding. The best way that I think about servant leadership is it's essentially a practical philosophy. It's a worldview that says, as a leader, my first priority is to serve the needs of others. It was in modern times coined by Robert Greenleaf. That was in the late 70s. Of course, we can see servant leadership, that philosophy of putting others' needs first, their well-being, their growth needs first. Certainly that's the leadership philosophy that Jesus would have expressed, 2 millennia ago. And certainly recently, those of us who, were reminded of the scriptures, the Last Supper is all about servant leadership. So certainly for some people, the idea of servant leadership, that we have exercised our true power by serving others, seems paradoxical. I think we're benefited here at St. Joe's that it doesn't strike us as being paradoxical, that of course we are called to serve others. Of course we are called to put others' needs first. As Pope Francis said, true power is to serve. So the ultimate goal of servant leadership, by serving the well-being needs, the growth needs of others, is ultimately, as Greenleaf said, to help others grow themselves into being servant leaders. So I certainly see my parenting of my son. He's a 9th grader downstairs, frustrated that our internet is not working right now. I think our role as loving parents are to be servant leaders. We put others first. We put our children first. We want to see them grow and become independent. So same thing here with servant leadership in an organizational or business context. We put others' needs first, wanting to see them grow.
Thanks, Ron. And Tom, based on your experience, could you maybe give insights on the difference between a leader and a manager?
Rosie, I'd be happy to. I'm sorry that I can't attend visually today, some technical problems. But yeah, I like to use the definition and difference between leadership and management is that leadership is the art of taking risk. Management is the science of mitigating risk. What we want to do in developing leaders is to allow managers that are aspiring leaders to make some mistakes. If we create an environment where you can never do a mistake, what ends up happening is you get to a point where you're always trying to control or avoid risk at all costs, and really no innovation can happen. So it really is an art. I also like to use the definition of leadership as leadership is taking a group of people to a place they didn't want to go to, and when they get there, they celebrate how smart they were getting there on their own. Leadership is never about the leader, but it's about the mission, and it's about urging people to tap into the very depth of their own souls and competencies and to really achieve the mission together collectively as a team. So it's very much a team sport, and the leader understands that and really brings the best out in people to get to a particular mission or goal.
Thanks, Tom. And I know a lot of folks, as you mentioned, Ron, will think about a Jesuit education and Ignatian values and servant leadership. You're right, it ties completely one to the other. So how do you think a Jesuit education speaks to leading in uncertain times, given that connection, Ron?
Well, that's a great question, Rosie. I think that, if ever there were a time where the world needs Jesuit educated individuals, it's today. And it's, the order was founded at a time that probably would have been described, certainly as of then, 500 years ago, as being the most complex world ever to have existed. Globalization was starting to take place. People were traveling the world for the first time. So today is the day for Jesuit education. And why is that? So certainly to build on something that Tom just said, the idea that leaders put the mission first, that's something that St. Ignatius talked about through his concept of indifference. I think it's important to really quickly insert that indifference doesn't mean I don't care. Indifference means I care so much about the mission, I care so much about the purpose, that then I don't care how we get it done. So it's not just my way of getting something done. It's exactly what Tom said. It's how we can collectively get the work done, fulfill that purpose, fulfill the mission. So indifference, I think, comes directly from our Jesuit education. The idea of being a contemplative in action. Those of us who are, which I think describes everyone in on this call right now, engaged in the world. And what makes Jesuit education so valuable is we're not just engaged for the sake of engagement. We're not just doing to be busy. We're doing to make the world better. And we have reflective practice in doing so. The idea of cure personalis, so caring for the whole person. Certainly our students are stressed, and our professors at St. Joe's certainly, and probably many professors elsewhere, care not just about the academic growth of our students, especially in times like this. We care about the personal growth, the spiritual well-being of our students. And the last thing, I could keep going for a very long time, is that idea of finding God in all things, finding good in all things. That yes, even in crisis, in uncertain times, for us to look around and to see people rising up to the challenge. I see my son being more resilient through this than I would have guessed him to be. What a gift that is to learn that about him through this occasion.
Thanks, Ron. I think that really ties nicely with what Tom was saying earlier around leading or managing. At the core, what you just spoke to was people. It wasn't the science of doing, it was the human that is. And I think that that is something not to be taken for granted of ever, but especially in a time like now.
Great point, well said.
So for our audience, we would love for you to use the Q&A feature to submit who you consider to be a servant leader. And a bit later in the presentation, we'll assess trends that we see and discuss them as a group. So, Tom, would you be able to speak a bit to what companies or organizations stand out to you in practicing tenets of servant leadership?
Yeah, I'm going to be careful about not picking on any particular companies, because I think we have many examples of people not exhibiting servant leadership today. I think we can look to our politicians across the aisle and realize that people are more worried about politics than they are about leadership. And it makes some sense, right? Because Congress are really representing groups of people. They're not representing a company per se. But I would characterize the smaller companies that are family owned, that continue to pay their employees out of their own personal wealth, as an example of servant leaders, recognizing that part of leadership's responsibility is to iron out the wrinkles for the people that work in their institutions and organizations, and being able to continue their incomes, I think, is really laudatory. I single them out over large corporations, because large corporations, although a lot of them are continuing people's salaries, it's a lot different, because it's not coming out of their own personal wealth, it's coming out of the organization. But I think smaller companies are a great example. I have a friend who has a small company in Lancaster with 160 employees, and he has done that his whole time of owning and operating the company, and I really admire that. I think the military is another example where we have servant leadership. To me, in addition to the things that Ron was talking about, the willingness, as our ultimate leader Christ did in laying down your life for your beloved, is a really good example of what happens in the military. Both leaders and those that are served in leadership are both, for a mission or a greater purpose, willing to lay down their lives. And to me, that's the ultimate sacrifice of the servant leader. Otherwise, globally, I think we're finding great definitions of what not to look like, so we can do a sort of an evaluation later on what we saw are opportunities for improvement in leadership across the world.
Thanks, Tom. And I know, Ron, as part of the coursework that you teach at St. Joe's in the Haub School, you talk about servant leadership with your students. You likely talk about specific organizations that take these tenets and have them throughout the company. Do you have any examples that you could share about with the audience today?
Sure. So I'll echo what Tom said, that there certainly are a lot of opportunities to look around and see perhaps what not to do. General MacArthur, I learned this during my time at West Point, famously said that he learned more about leadership from poor leaders than from great leaders. And there are some exemplary organizations as well. So, I would argue just about any healthcare organization today is embodying servant leadership. And I saw on our attendee list Dr. Webby, who is at Jefferson Healthcare. He's a St. Joe's alum, and he's out there on the front lines exhibiting servant leadership. Every food bank is exhibiting it. From a corporate perspective, I am a huge fan of the servant leadership culture that Wawa has developed over the years, really from their founding. And they capture it very well, I think, in their purpose statement, which is fulfilling lives every day. And they are who they are. They're an authentic company, that they're not going to necessarily save the big world. They're serving communities, and to remain focused on that, I think is something, a real big takeaway that we can learn from this occasion. Is servant leadership is about really, tending to your knitting, doing what you do and do it well, is a manifestation of servant leadership.
Thank you. And thank you all for your feedback in the Q&A feature. Megan, would you be able to share a few of the results that people have?
Sure. We have a
sent
couple. Someone, yeah, sure. We have someone mentioned Oprah, Malala Yousafzai, Martin Luther King, and our own Sister Mary Scullion.
Great. Thanks, Megan. So as we think about, these servant leaders, and maybe servant leaders that we've experienced personally, Ron, do you think there are specific qualities of servant leaders that stand out as being a key quality for servant leaders?
Sure, and I'm looking at the names that Megan just read off. Certainly one that I would add into that mix is Dr. FACHE, who is very famously Jesuit educated. Back to your earlier question, Rosie. And you look at these great leaders, and you see, I think, within them, some of the key themes that I can see within them is something that Father Byron here on campus coined this great word that says humbition. And humbition is this combination of being humble and ambitious. So we're humble because we know that the work is not about me, but we're ambitious because the work that we're doing is important. And I think you see any of the names that Megan just read off that our participants are raising as exemplars, and we see ambition, so that they themselves are more committed to the work than they are necessarily to glorifying themselves. I see the idea of authenticity. Back to what I mentioned a moment ago about Wawa. People that were just listed, those leaders are really true to to who they are and who the moment needs them to be. So authenticity in leadership is not just about, take it or leave it. This is who I am. Authentic leadership is about being true to oneself and true to the moment, true to the context. And all those leaders, I think, share that in common.
Great. Thank you, Ron. And I think, too, something that is very much worth mentioning to a similar vein, that leaders they're human as well. They have stress, and they have, they have human happenings. And in that time, the people that look to them as a leader, or they are leading from behind, still will rely on them. And Tom, I'd be really interested in your insights, especially with your background in healthcare, about how servant leaders draw inspiration to persevere when they're experiencing some of that personal strife.
Certainly. I think part of what we have to do, all of us, is do some self-care. I think I like to characterize leadership as needing to work on several areas of the whole human person in order to be able to withstand the vicissitudes of leadership. One is to lead a life of the mind, being committed to lifelong learning and drawing from a deep well of experience. We see Dr. FACHE doing that, as Ron mentioned. Leading a life of physical activity so that we have the stamina. Again, Dr. FACHE, I think he's a marathoner. he even now is figuring out ways to exercise despite what sounds like is a 24-hour schedule. A life of the spirit, that gives them that eternal hope and optimism, and continually working on those shadowy times, so that when the shadows really fall down on you, you can actually work your way out of it, because you have a very strong sense of the battle that you have to prepare for. It's interesting, in Scripture, when it talks about preparing yourself for battle, it says, I think it's in Corinthians, about putting on, actually it's Ephesians, putting on the full armor of God. And the full armor of God is the breastplate of truth and the helmet of salvation. If you notice, those are actually only offensive armor. They're not defensive. So the idea that leadership is out there, you're always facing forward. And I think in order to prepare ourselves, we really have to have a balance between a life of the mind, a life of the physical body, and a life of the spirit, and prepare ourselves for that battle every day by making sure that those things are in sync.
Thank you. And I think, that speaks to that mission, that forward moment, that momentum of always knowing what we're doing and where we're going, and keeping our eye on it as a leader. That's really key to both of your points. We have maybe one more question before we return to some from the audience. And Ron, it'd be interesting to hear why you think uncertainty causes folks to have a hard time making decisions.
Yeah, so uncertainty is one of those things that really, I think for most of us, forces us to kind of withdraw a little bit. We are facing this 21st century world with a brain that was designed for complexity and uncertainty that I don't think we can handle. So part of our coping mechanism is to close off. And I think of myself, at least, and maybe I'm the only one in the circle who does this, but I see myself driving down the highway in a really driving pouring rain, and somehow turning off the radio helps me see the road better. And I think that's really how most of us approach leadership and uncertainty, that we start to close off signals, even though that's exactly when we ought to be bringing in signals and really intentionally sifting out the signal from the noise. So I think that's the underlying issue to your question, Rosie, is in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity and complexity, we have an animalistic learned response of closing off, whereas to be a servant leader needs us to be more open, to be better listeners, not more closed off.
It's really insightful. Thank you. Let's turn to some questions from all of you now, which will be asked by my colleague Megan. So as a reminder, if you're sending them in throughout the second half of the presentation, please include your name, your city, and if you're an alumnus, your class year. So Megan, why don't you get us started?
Great, thanks, Rosie. We have a number of great questions that have come in the last couple of minutes. The first one comes from Pete in Westchester, who asks, what prevents people from being effective servant leaders?
Tom, would you be able to give your insights on that?
Sure, I'm happy to. One of the things that I like to say about servant leadership is actually, I like to call it virtuous leadership. I think one thing that we don't talk a lot about is virtue in our society today. And to me, virtue is a practice, just like the practice of evil. I mean, if you practice evil long enough, you become pretty evil. If you practice virtue over and over, you get better at it. And I think that leaders are really called to be ethical, which means that what they say they'll do, they do. If they're humble, they put other people first. They have to be skilled communicators. They have to practice mercy. And they have to be authentic. And I think that that's one of the problems that people have with making decisions. If you're an authentic person and you know you're trying to lead the best life possible, then there's really nothing bad that can happen to you. And you need to put yourself out there and realize that if you're authentic and you're trying your best, that people are going to give you what I call the benefit of the doubt. They're going to let you withdraw from the reservoir of virtue that you've built up, and they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt when times get really tough. And there's never a 100% solution. The 100% solution in healthcare today is, well, you shut everything down during the pandemic and you just wait till it's over. And of course, you know, that's easy if you're a manager or a scientist, because you know, you have no accountability for the economy or anything else happens, but you've certainly gotten rid of it, of the virus. So leaders really have to understand that they're only going to get about 70 to 80% of the information to make decisions. And I think if they make decisions in goodwill and they are authentic and they put themselves out there and basically tell folks what the reality of it is and what the risks are, I think that they'll be much more empowered to make decisions for people than they seem to be today. If you never want to make a mistake because you're afraid, then as a result of that, you'll never be able to move forward.
Great, and it speaks to vulnerability as well. You know, a key component of a leader is to be vulnerable and to model out vulnerability for those to say, if you make a mistake, we'll move forward. But not doing anything is likely worse in a lot of situations. Thanks, Tom. Megan, is there another question?
Sure, there's actually one that's sort of a recurring theme, but I'll ask on the version that came from Carrie in the audience. What advice do you have for someone in middle management who wants to be a servant leader, but may not be the ultimate decision maker in her department or firm?
It's a very good question. Ron, why don't you share your thoughts?
Yeah, Carrie's asking a great question. And really I have two related thoughts to that. One is to focus on what's within our control. That, you know, for us to be more effective and more thoughtful servant leaders doesn't mean that we have to make all the decisions. Doesn't mean we have to have that nice corner office where everything depends on every decision that we make. But the real meaning is in the domains where we do lead. Are we leading in a more thoughtful way, attending to others' needs, subjugating my ego to the needs of others? And certainly I was reflecting to what Tom was saying earlier about you know, the true essence of leadership from servant leadership in the military perspective is the willingness to put down one's life, to lose one's life. Very, very few of us, thank God, face that decision at work. Some people, of course, do. But most of us will make the decision, do we lay down, are we willing to let our egos die? So even if it's not physical death, it might be ego death. Are we willing to subjugate my ego for the well-being of others? So I would say to Carrie to focus on what is within our control. And the other important thought that comes to me is the need to keep in mind that servant leadership is not just about quote unquote serving down from a hierarchical perspective. It's not just about, you know, taking care of my 3 or 4 direct reports. And if I don't have direct reports, then I have to wait till I have direct reports to really be a servant leader. I think that's wrong. And certainly Carrie's not implying that, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we can be servant leaders to our peers, to our colleagues. We can absolutely be servant leaders, and we should be servant leaders to our bosses. And many people I hear over the years, you know, I'd love to be a servant leader, but my company just, you know, that doesn't tolerate that, or my boss is the antithesis. And I would say, you know, let's lead by example. That certainly, by all means, research clearly says that, you know, culture matters, context matters. So there might be some organizations that will not allow for servant leadership, and that might trigger some discernment whether we belong there. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we should be serving up. Certainly, you know, giving our bosses the benefit of the doubt, being more forgiving, being more understanding. So there's a lot within our control if we take seriously this mantle, this charge that we're all leading all the time. The only question is, are we doing so in a thoughtful way or in a thoughtless way?
Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jim, who's the class of 1958. And my question relates to how leaders are chosen. In many cases, servant leadership often does not serve one well in reaching the top. As one who lived in the corporate world and on multiple boards, this issue is often a problem in CEO choice, with the person who gets the brass ring often focusing on themselves. Do you have any useful insights into how decision processes, particularly in the corporate world, could better reflect servant leadership?
Tom, why don't you share your thoughts?
Okay, thank you. I thought you might throw that one my way. It's a great question, and you know, one of the things I'll give you a personal example of one, because I was recruiting a fairly high level senior vice president for my organization, and I was looking at internal candidates, and I had a preferred candidate, but I decided that I had been preaching about the collective wisdom of the group, and they focused on another candidate, and they liked that other candidate much better than my candidate. So I accepted that. Unfortunately, the person that I was espousing left the organization, but really more importantly is the group's collective wisdom was better than mine alone. And I found very humbly that this person was enormously successful, has continued to serve in the organization as a senior executive, and will probably be CEO one day. The important thing about that is I think we really should, CEOs sometimes just focus on people that are like them, and they want to select somebody like them. And it's a lot different if you have a diverse group of leadership to let the group help you make that decision. Ultimately, you have to retain the ability to make the final decision. But I find that if we do it in a collaborative way, it's a much better way of deciding, particularly at the senior level, than just saying, well, I'm going to pick the next this or that. It also ensures that that person coming into the position has the buy-in of a number of people that could affect his or her success. And I think that that's very important as well.
Thank you. Our next question actually came in prior to the webinar at the registration period. Someone asked, pardon me, how can we utilize servant leadership in the recovery stages of the pandemic?
Ron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, servant leadership should be, I think, in every stage. On the recovery side, hopefully that's just around the corner for us. I think that the idea of attending to stakeholders, I think, is important. Is something that Tom mentioned a few minutes ago about the role of leaders vis-a-vis risk. And a lot of risk is about attending to the needs of various stakeholders. So for us to emerge from this crisis will require thoughtful servant leaders to attend to the variety of stakeholders that we might have. And just to define the term, because not everyone might be familiar with it, stakeholder is someone that holds a stake in an organization, that is affected by or affects an organization. So I think that's going to be an important part of our recovery. And I would also add that certainly once we are through this storm, and we will get through the storm, to not let up. So certainly the idea of responding to crisis is important. We have to get through the storm. I think it's critical to keep in mind that the best time to respond to crisis is before crisis even starts. So for us to really invest in ourselves as servant leaders, if that's not part of our practice now, we can start doing so. But certainly it's going to perhaps be easier once we're through the storm to then take take advantage of the space that we have to really hone our leadership tools. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that once we're through this, that's the time to especially focus on our own leadership growth and the leadership growth of those around us.
Thanks, Ron. I think that's really powerful, especially as we think about a Jesuit education and how key reflection is and contemplating the next step. We can't expect to go into the same world that we left prior to this. So how do we take these learnings to apply them forward will be really key. Absolutely.
Well said.
Thank you. I have a question from Kyle in Drexel Hill, who is class of 2020. Congratulations, Kyle. And he says, have there been scenarios or times when implementing servant leadership was personally challenging in your career? If so, how did you go about navigating those challenges?
Tom, I'll turn that one to you.
Okay. Well, the answer is yes. I think anytime a leader starts new in an organization, they start with a degree of what I would call a reservoir of goodwill. It depends on the organization and its current status, how much goodwill they're going to give you. And as a result of that, I think, part of leading through difficult times is digging a well very deeply of trying to be a virtuous and good leader as much as possible, because you dig from that well when you have difficult times. Having said that, when you move into a new organization, I think the best thing to do is be authentic as possible. Part of leadership is to recognize what your reality is, the reality that your organization as well as you are facing. And I think that if you're willing to be vulnerable and speak to the people that you're addressing, maybe it's a situation like the new captain that's going to come on the Roosevelt, that obviously liked the captain quite a bit before, and acknowledging that and acknowledging the loss of that, and saying, and we're going to have to build up credibility together, because you don't know me and I don't know you, but I know that this is a great organization and I'm looking forward to being part of it. I think that's the way you have to tackle it. I think you have to come in humility, be willing to learn, and I think that leaders that just walk in and decide that they're going to change everything are making a huge mistake. They're emptying that reservoir of goodwill before they even start, and I think that can be problematic for them down the road.
If I can build on something that Tom's talking about, I would say in response to Kyle, it should be challenging. So to assume the mantle of leadership ought to be challenging. I mean, the best way to not lose sleep as a leader is to not care. So to the extent that we can't do that, we can't let ourselves off the hook. When you graduate, and congratulations, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be difficult, and that's what comes with that idea of, as a servant leader, being willing to subjugate my ego. That hurts. It can hurt to be challenged. It can hurt to be told that you're wrong, or to learn that you're wrong. And that's what leaders do, is leaders accept that challenge. And I certainly have in my mind virtually every day a part of the West Point Cadet prayer that says, make us to choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong. And I think a corollary to that is, as I choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong, is if it's not hard, it probably isn't right. So if I'm not challenged by this, then perhaps it's the wrong thing for me to be doing. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of work, Kyle, and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be so fulfilling, so rewarding to see others grow around you over the years, and it's going to be a challenge.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first of which is coming from Bridget in Boulder, Colorado, who's class of 2018. And she says, Dr. Dufresne talked about the importance of reflection in servant leadership. Are there any new questions or elements of a reflection practice that a strong servant leader should introduce or focus on more deeply in this unprecedented time?
And I think that one naturally can start with you.
Hi, Bridget, Team Leo, I miss you. So, I mean, the thing with reflection to me is it has to be authentic to the point that it's sustainable. If you're not a journaler, and you've tried to journal, 10 different times and it just never sticks, then turns out that journaling isn't a great way for you to engage in your reflective practice. For me, I find myself, I'm not a great journaler for as much, and the students who are on this call let's forget that I just said that. I journal all the time, trust me. But no, for me, I'm not a great journaler. So for me, reflective practice looks like walking my dog with my phone back at home. So I think to answer Bridget's question, it is a function of perhaps trial and error, that you might not realize what works for you until you've tried 8 different ways of engaging in your own reflective practice. Be it turning off the radio in your car back when we get onto the roads, when you drive home from work, and just spending 10, 15, 20 minutes in silence. That might be something that works for you. Be it just time in the shower, just time alone to think your own thoughts. It could be yoga, it could be exercise, certainly could be journaling, could be obviously a part of your prayer practice. So yeah, I think it's going to have to be authentic to the point that you can stick with it.
Okay, and for our last question, this sort of combines a number of items that I've gotten through the Q&A, and I'll just sort of pull them all together. What books, social media accounts, and podcasts would you recommend people look into to further examine servant leadership?
Tom, why don't you get us started, and then Ron, you can jump in with anything else.
Well, I can't think of a lot of podcasts or anything, but I'll tell you, I'll refer you to one book. I hate to tell you which books to read because I think you have to find the ones that really resonate with you. And I would recommend that you read some scripture and literature along with that, because I think it helps us reflect in leadership, and learning from Macbeth and King Lear is not a bad idea sometimes. And the one that I particularly like, though, is by Alexander Haub actually, and it's called Virtuous Leadership. And I find that his focus on issues like magnanimity and humility and courage and the cardinal virtues is really helpful in really discerning a leadership style for yourself. And then I think reflective reading is also very, very useful. The Ignatian Examen, a daily prayer that allows us to adapt our prayer to our situation and to our life, I think is important. And the last thing I would do is recommend to you, there is a litany of humility, which is a great thing for leaders. So if you ever want to see what a leader's really like, should be like, and from a Christian perspective anyway, it starts out, just read you 2 lines of it. It says, "Oh, Jesus, meek and humble of heart, hear me. From the desire of being esteemed, deliver me. From the desire of being extolled, deliver me." It goes on to talk about being humiliated. Please deliver me, not from humiliation, but from the desire, because I think that those are all part of the practice and leadership, so that when you become a leader, you have, as Ron said, you really have a thick skin, but you have a really deep well of virtue to draw on that people respect, so that you do have that benefit of the doubt when you get to the really difficult times. Turn it over to Ryan.
Yeah, and I'm very frequently and gladly asked for various things to read. I wish that I knew more about podcasts, similar to what Tom said. I need to get with it. But certainly in my mind, I would echo everything that Tom said, that virtually any text can be read from a servant leadership perspective. By all means, great literature has a lot of exemplars of how to and how not to engage as servant leaders. If once this is done, if folks wanted to jump onto Amazon and just search servant leadership, there's going to be a ton of resources, and many of them are in fact great. I'm more partial, in fact, to servant leadership texts that don't even talk about explicitly servant leadership. So I think of, for example, Amy Edmondson's book, Fearless Organization. Amy is on faculty at Harvard, and she spent her career developing leaders to encourage psychological safety. So psychological safety is that belief within an organization, within a team, that it's a safe place to take a risk, to admit making mistakes, to well-meaning experimental mistakes, to admit to being wrong. Servant leadership requires psychological safety. So to read Edmondson's Fearless Organization is going to help us grow as a servant leader. Bob Quinn's Building the Bridge as You Walk on It, something that I've assigned for my MBA classes over the years, I don't think it ever uses the phrase servant leadership, but to build the bridge as you walk on it requires one to be a servant leader, to open myself to the needs of others and to be more collaborative in doing so. And I would say the last book that certainly is, I think, on the servant leaders short list would be, in my mind, David Brooks's Road to Character. And he's got a new book called The Two Mountains that build upon the same thought that really there are two versions of most of us. There's the resume self and the eulogy self. And the more concerned we are with the resume self of ticking the boxes, and that tends to be about me, my ego, the less we are focused on the virtuous self that Tom was just talking about, which is what we tend to hear about at eulogies. We hear about kindness, we hear about forgiveness, we hear about magnanimity as part of the eulogy, and Brooks makes the argument, let's work on that. If we do work on that, when we do work on that in fact will grow us as servant leaders. And the last thing that I'll respond to the group of questions that Megan posed. Certainly follow Pope Francis on Twitter. He is a font of remarkably simple thoughts that are so powerful. And Chef Jose Andres. He is one of the great servant leaders that is walking among us right now. World famous chef who is completely changing his orientation to feeding the world. So yeah, check out Jose Andres.
Thanks, Ron.
Great.
Tom, any final thoughts you'd like us to leave us with?
Well, I think, at the end of the day, for me, the kind of servant leadership that we're talking about boils down to, character. And I really like what Lao Tzu said about character. Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, so they become character. And your character becomes your destiny. And I think we forget that sometimes. And each thought that we have, each word that we say that's negative, is building up that sort of negative virtue that can lead us down a path to leadership that really isn't the kind of leader that we would respect or anyone else. So that in particular, I think is something to think about.
Thanks, Tom. And Ron, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I have a couple that I want to make sure that we leave thinking about. And one is something we haven't talked about in this conversation. I think it's important to keep in mind that to be a servant leader doesn't mean necessarily to be soft. So it doesn't mean that we're running a daycare at work. It means doing great work. And part of that is, in fact, to hold people to very high standards. So just as, back to the parenting metaphor, we want the best for our children. And certainly we want the best for those around us at work. So we should have very high standards as servant leaders. So it's not just about always, giving people the easy way out. In fact, sometimes, and this is, I think, a good thought experiment. Imagine someone that comes to us at 5 o'clock on a Friday and says, God, I'm so sorry. I'm going to miss the deadline. And, my family and I are going away for the weekend. How should a servant leader respond to that? Certainly we can think of that for a second. And it's going to really boil down to our relationship with that individual and what we know about that individual and their growth needs. It could be that the person has been working for 15 straight days and really just needs the time away. In that case, we might very well say, you know what, I got it from here. It could be that the person has, you and the other have spent a lot of time talking about holding that person to a higher standard and helping them grow and challenge themselves. In that case, you might very well say, I need you to stick around and finish it before you leave. So note that those are diametrically opposed behaviors, motivated hopefully by the same thing. What is better for them? So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, that it's not just about always saying, you know what, I got it from here. You know, servant leaders are not doormats. Servant leaders hold people to higher standards to help them grow. And of course, we want their mutual influence as well. We count on them to help us grow as well.
Well, thank you both so much for your insights and expertise in today's conversation. I can't believe how fast an hour went based on just the amazing questions from the audience, as well as really insightful comments and thoughts from both of you. Thank you to St. Joseph's University for hosting this event, and to all the advancement and marketing team members for coordinating, and the IT folks supporting behind the scenes as well. Again, today's session was recorded, and it will be emailed to our attendees and will also be posted on the Unlimited Learning website. Make sure to share it and look out for future webinars at sju.edu/unlimitedlearning, and we hope that you join us again. Finally, thank you again for joining us. We know it's an unprecedented time, as we've said many times throughout the conversation, and as so many people are saying likely at the start of all of their conversations with you. So we're very grateful for you to be part of this community, and we really do wish you and your loved ones happiness and health. Be well.